Today we're going to unpack an incredible story. It's one part historical detective work, one part high-stakes international law, all to solve a puzzle that set two nations against each other. We're going to get right into exactly how the International Court of Justice untangled a really complex border dispute right on the African continent.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. Picture this. You have to draw a permanent, official line between two countries. But the thing you're drawing on, it's a river that is constantly shifting, changing its course. That was the huge challenge facing the nations of Benin and Niger.
And yeah, to make things even more complicated, that river is just full of islands. One of them, Leyte Island, is massive, about 40 square kilometers. It's fertile, and thousands of people live there permanently. So you see, the stakes here weren't just about some line on a map. They were about land, they were about resources, and whole communities.
So, after decades of incidents, failed negotiations, you name it, Benin and Niger did something pretty remarkable. Instead of letting things escalate into a bigger conflict, they actually came together. They jointly brought their dispute over the Niger and Mekru rivers to the International Court of Justice, and they asked for a final, a peaceful, and a totally binding resolution.
So how in the world does a court even begin to tackle something like this? Well, the judges basically had to become historical investigators, digging through dusty old colonial archives, and their entire investigation was guided by one single fundamental principle.
And that principle is called possidetis, juris. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. The court isn't there to draw a new border. No, its job is to uncover and restore the boundary that already existed at the exact moment French colonial rule ended and these nations became independent. The best way to think about it is like this. The court's mission was basically to develop an old photograph. They needed to find a snapshot of the territory, freezing it exactly as it was back in August 1960. Any changes that happened after that date, they just don't count, unless both countries agreed to them. Everything, and I mean everything, hinged on finding that original negative.
Okay, so let's dive into the first and, frankly, the most complex part of this investigation, the mighty River Niger. This is where the real heart of the dispute was, especially when it came to that incredibly valuable Leyte Island. And right off the bat, the two countries' claims were, well, polar opposites. Benin argued that the boundary was the left bank of the river. Now, if that were true, it would mean the entire riverbed and all of its islands, yep, including Leyte, belonged to them. Niger, on the other hand, argued the boundary was the main navigable channel, kind of like the deepest part of the river. That would split the islands between them. So we're talking about two totally different outcomes.
So the court started where you'd expect. They examined the paper trail. And wow, was it a mess. A legal order, an arrêté, from 1900 seemed to support Benin's claim, talking about areas on the left bank. But just 1 year later, a minister's letter uses the super vague phrase, the course of the Niger. Later documents just repeated that same imprecise language. And then, get this, in 1954, a letter from Niger's own governor seemed to just hand everything over to Benin. The clues were pointing in every direction at once. So after sifting through all of this, the court came to a pretty stark conclusion. The paper trail, it was a dead end. The documents were way too ambiguous, too contradictory. Neither Benin nor Niger could definitively prove their case based on these old administrative acts alone. The legal titles, as they're called, just weren't clear enough.
So, with the paper trail leading nowhere, you'd think the investigation would just hit a wall. But nope, the court had another tool in its kit. If the documents couldn't provide the answer, well, maybe the reality on the ground could. They needed to look for evidence of who was actually in charge.
And this is where another key legal idea comes into play, effectiveness. It just refers to the real, tangible acts of running a place. The court essentially had to ask, forget the confusing maps for a second. Who was collecting the taxes? Who was running the schools? Who was policing the area? Basically, who was acting like the government here?
So let's just break down the logic here, because this pivot is absolutely crucial. First, the legal titles from the colonial era were a bust. Too ambiguous. So second, the court shifted its focus to those effectivités, how the areas were actually governed. And third, that's where they found their breakthrough clue, a local agreement from 1914 that, while not a formal treaty, showed exactly how the local administrators had been handling the border for decades.
And this, right here, was the key. This practical evidence, this 1914 modus vivendi, or working arrangement, showed a clear long-standing practice. From 1914 all the way up to 1954, the main navigable channel was treated as the boundary. It turns out Niger administered the islands to the left of that channel, including Leyte, and Dahomey, which is now Benin, administered the islands to the right.
And all of this led directly to the court's final call for the River Niger. Based on that long-standing practice, Leyte Island was awarded to Niger. The islands near the town of Gaia went to Benin, and for all the other little islands, the rule was simple. If it's to the left of the main channel, it belongs to Niger. If it's to the right, it belongs to Benin. A really clear split based on what was actually happening, not on some confusing old paperwork.
All right, so let's shift gears and move to the second part of the puzzle, the River Macro, and see how this one built a completely different kind of case. This was the western part of the boundary, and well, it turned out to be much more straightforward.
So unlike that whole tangled mess with the Niger River, where the paper trail was a dead end, here the administrative documents were actually clear and consistent. The judges didn't even need to rely on those effectivités because the legal titles themselves told a coherent story.
Now, Niger initially pointed to a decree from 1907 that seemed to set the boundary on land. But the court found that a later arrêté from 1927, one issued by the proper authority, the Governor General, explicitly defined the boundary as the River Macro. And this was then reinforced over and over again in later documents creating national parks in the area. The evidence just kept pointing to the river itself as the border.
So for this part of the river, the final verdict was just dead simple and totally unanimous. The boundary is the median line of the River Macro. And because this part of the river isn't really used for navigation, the court chose the middle line to make things as clear and secure as possible. Case closed.
And so, after combing through decades of colonial laws, local practices, and river charts, the court was finally ready to draw that final line and deliver its judgment.
But here's the thing, it wasn't just a simple, unanimous decision. For that highly contentious River Niger part, the one involving Leyte Island, the Chamber of Judges actually voted 4-1. So while the majority opinion carried the day, there was a powerful voice of dissent.
And that dissenting voice belonged to Judge Benuna. He filed a formal dissenting opinion, basically arguing that the court got it wrong. In his view, those original legal titles were clear enough, and they placed the boundary on the left bank, which would have meant all the islands should have gone to Benin. It's just a fascinating reminder that even with the exact same evidence, legal experts can come to very different conclusions. But at the end of the day, the majority ruling is what stands. On July 12, 2005, the line was officially drawn. A dispute that had simmered for decades, one that really could have led to serious conflict, was instead settled peacefully and definitively, with both nations accepting the outcome.
And really, that leaves us with a final thought. In a world where border disputes are all too often settled with violence, this case just stands as a powerful example of a different path. It makes you wonder, what does it truly mean for two neighboring countries to choose a courtroom over a conflict zone to define the very lines that make them who they are?